The thermometer inside the cockpit of the B-17 Flying Fortress read 60 degrees below zero. At 27,000 feet above the Third Reich, the air was thin, lethal, and froze human flesh in seconds. It was December 20th, 1943. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old farm boy from West Virginia, sat in the left seat of a bomber named Olde Pub. His hands were encased in thick leather gloves, gripping the yoke with a desperation that was the only thing keeping 10 men alive. This was his first combat mission. He had never seen a German fighter. He had never seen flak. He had never seen a man die. By noon, he would see it all. The target was Bremen, specifically the Focke-Wulf 190 factory, an industrial heart pumping out the very fighter planes that were currently trying to kill them. Intelligence had briefed the crews that morning. They were told to expect heavy resistance. That was a military euphemism. The reality was a wall of steel. Bremen was defended by 250 heavy anti-aircraft guns, manned not by conscripts, but by the elite officer candidates of the Luftwaffe. These were the best gunners in Germany, and they were angry. Brown's position in the formation was the worst possible assignment for a rookie crew. They were flying Purple Heart Corner, the extreme outside edge of the high squadron. In the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare, this was the kill zone. When the Luftwaffe attacked, they didn't dive into the center of the formation where the defensive fire was overlapping and deadly. They picked off the stragglers on the edges. They culled the herd. And Olde Pub was the most exposed sheep in the flock. Before they even reached the target, the sky turned black. The flak bursts were so dense they looked like a paved road of smoke. Brown watched the ships ahead of him bob and weave through the concussions. Then the hammer fell. A single anti-aircraft shell, fused for exactly 27,000 feet, detonated directly in front of Olde Pub. The explosion shattered the plexiglass nose of the bomber. The wind blast was instantaneous and catastrophic. A hurricane of freezing air, screaming at 150 miles per hour, tore through the fuselage. The temperature inside the plane dropped instantly to match the Arctic conditions outside. The No. 2 engine was hit and died immediately, its propeller windmilling uselessly against the drag. The No. 4 engine, damaged by shrapnel, began to surge violently, threatening to tear itself off the wing. Brown fought the controls, throttling back the runaway engine to prevent it from exploding. The loss of power was a death sentence. The massive bomber formation, thundering along at cruise speed, began to pull away. Olde Pub was heavy, crippled, and slowing down. Brown watched the distance between him and his wingman grow. 10 yards, 50 yards, 100. He was losing the protection of the group. He was alone in hostile skies, dragging a wounded Leviathan through the heart of Germany. And then the sharks arrived. They came from above, diving out of the sun. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. The yellow-nosed fighters of Jagdgeschwader 11. They had spotted the straggler. It was the scenario every bomber crew had nightmares about. A lone B-17, lagging behind, damaged, with no friends to cover its blind spots. The German pilots didn't rush. They lined up methodically. They knew the B-17 was tough, but nothing is indestructible. The attack lasted 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The German fighters came in waves, slashing at the bomber with 20mm cannons and machine gun fire. The sound inside Olde Pub was a deafening cacophony of roaring engines, wind, and the sledgehammer impacts of cannon shells tearing through aluminum. The bomber was being dismantled piece by piece. The rudder was shredded. The port elevator was blown completely off. The hydraulic lines were severed, bleeding red fluid all over the interior. The electrical system shorted out. In the tail section, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode was fighting for his life. As the tail gunner, he was the first line of defense against attacks from the rear. He fired burst after burst from his twin .50 calibers, trying to hold back the swarm. But a German fighter lined up a perfect shot. A 20mm cannon shell smashed into the tail turret. It exploded on impact. Eckenrode, the smallest man on the crew, never stood a chance. He was killed instantly, his body slumped over the useless guns. The damage rippled forward. In the waist of the plane, Sergeant Alex Yelisenko took a piece of shrapnel in his leg. It was a severe wound, and in the sub-zero temperatures, shock set in immediately. The crew tried to help him, but the morphine syrettes in the first aid kits were frozen solid. They were useless blocks of ice. The men had to keep fighting, stepping over casing shells and frozen blood. Up in the cockpit, Charlie Brown was losing the battle. The No. 3 engine was now failing, sputtering and coughing. He had one good engine left out of 4. And then, the final blow. A cannon shell hit the oxygen system. The vital supply of breathable air, essential for survival at 27,000 feet, hissed away into the slipstream. Hypoxia is a silent killer. It doesn't hurt. It simply turns off the lights. Brown felt his vision tunnel. The world went gray, then black. His hands, numb and frozen, slipped from the yoke. Beside him, his co-pilot, Spencer Luke, was already slumped over, unconscious. The B-17, unpiloted and battered, nosed over. It began to dive. The bomber fell from the sky like a stone. It dropped 5,000 feet, 10,000, 15,000. The airspeed indicator spun past the red line. The airframe groaned, the rivets screaming under the pressure. The German fighters, assuming the bomber was in a terminal death dive, broke off their attack. No one survived a dive like that. They marked it as a kill and turned away to find new targets. But ye Olde Pub refused to die. As the bomber plummeted toward the German countryside, the air pressure increased. The oxygen levels rose. At roughly 1,000 feet, seconds before impact, Charlie Brown gasped. His brain, flooded with oxygen-rich air, rebooted. He opened his eyes to see the ground rushing up to meet him. Green fields, roofs, trees. Instinct took over. He grabbed the yoke with both hands and pulled. He put his boots against the instrument panel and hauled back with every ounce of hysterical strength he possessed. The B-17 groaned. The wings bent, but they held. The bomber leveled out, screaming over the treetops of northern Germany at 250 miles per hour, barely missing the church steeples. Brown shook his head, clearing the fog of hypoxia. He looked around. The cockpit was a wreck. He looked at his co-pilot, who was slowly waking up. He checked the instruments. Oil pressure was critical. Fuel was leaking. 3 engines were dead or dying. He was flying a wreck, alone, deep in enemy territory at treetop level. And then he realized where he was. In the chaos of the recovery, he had leveled out directly over a German airfield. Below him, on the tarmac of the Luftwaffe base at WWII, a black Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 was idling. The pilot, Franz Stigler, was standing on the wing, refueling and rearming. Stigler was an ace, a veteran. He had 27 confirmed kills to his name. He needed just one more to qualify for the Knight's Cross, the highest military honor in Germany. It was the medal every pilot dreamed of. It was the medal that would honor his brother, August, a pilot who had been killed early in the war. Stigler heard the roar of engines. He looked up. He saw the B-17 thunder overhead. So low he could see the rivets. He saw the smoking engines. He saw the shattered nose. He saw the kill that would make him a hero. Stigler threw his cigarette to the ground. He jumped into the cockpit of his fighter. The ground crew scrambled to pull the chocks. The Daimler-Benz engine roared to life, spitting blue smoke. Within seconds, Stigler was rolling down the runway. He was airborne in less than a minute. The Bf 109 was a predator, fast and agile. Stigler climbed rapidly, closing the distance on the limping bomber. It was almost too easy. The American plane was a sitting duck. It was dragging its tail, slow and heavy. Stigler checked his guns. His cannon was loaded. His machine guns were ready. He needed 3 seconds of fire to disintegrate the bomber and claim his Knight's Cross. He approached from the rear, the classic executioner's angle. He positioned his fighter slightly below the bomber's tail, lining up his sights to rake the fuselage from stern to stem. His finger rested on the trigger. He took a breath, steadying his hand. He looked through the WWII gun sight, placing the crosshairs on the B-17's tail. And then Franz Stigler froze. What he saw through the gun sight didn't look like a machine of war. It looked like a slaughterhouse. The entire tail section of the B-17 had been blown away. The defensive guns were hanging limp. Through the gaping hole in the fuselage, Stigler could see directly into the interior of the plane. He saw the body of the tail gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, soaked in blood that had frozen into long red icicles trailing in the wind. He saw the shredded skin of the aircraft, flapping like torn rags. Stigler lifted his finger off the trigger. He eased the throttle forward, sliding his sleek fighter plane alongside the ruined bomber. He flew closer, within 20 feet. He could see the waist gunners. They weren't manning their weapons. They were huddled over a wounded comrade, trying to stem the bleeding. The interior of the plane was a wreck. This wasn't a combatant anymore. This was a flying hearse. In that moment, a memory flashed through Stigler's mind. North Africa, 1942. The scorching desert sun. His commanding officer, Gustav Rudel, standing before the young pilots of Jagdgeschwader 27. Rudel had been a man of the old school, a believer in chivalry even in the face of total war. He had looked Stigler in the eye and said words that would now determine the fate of 10 Americans. "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Stigler looked at the B-17. The men inside weren't in parachutes, but they might as well have been. They were defenseless. They were broken. To shoot them down now wouldn't be a victory. It wouldn't be combat. It would be murder. And Franz Stigler, despite the swastika painted on the tail of his plane, was not a murderer. He made a decision that could get him executed for treason. He pulled his fighter up, level with the cockpit of the bomber. He looked across the small gap of air separating them. Charlie Brown, struggling to keep the heavy B-17 in the air, turned his head. He saw the black cross of the Luftwaffe fighter just feet from his wingtip. He saw the pilot's face, goggled and masked. Brown's heart stopped. He waited for the muzzle flash. He waited for the end. But the flash never came. Instead, the German pilot did something impossible. He nodded. For the crew of Ye Olde Pub, the appearance of the German fighter was the final nail in the coffin. Charlie Brown sat frozen in the left seat, his hands white-knuckled on the yoke, watching the Messerschmitt Bf 109 slide into formation off his left wingtip. The enemy plane was so close that Brown could read the stenciled maintenance warnings on its fuselage. He could see the rivets. He could see the pilot's eyes. Brown yelled over the intercom to his top turret gunner, Sergeant Bertrand "Frenchy" Coulombe. "Don't shoot! Do not shoot unless he shoots first." It was a desperate gamble. Brown assumed the German was toying with them, perhaps waiting for his wingman to arrive to finish the job, or maybe radioing their position to ground control. If Coulombe opened fire now, the German would shred them in seconds. They were at his mercy. But Franz Stigler was not radioing for help. He was trying to save them. Stigler knew that Ye Olde Pub was a flying wreck. He could see the holes in the fuselage large enough to crawl through. He knew they had no rudder control, no stabilizer, and were bleeding altitude. More importantly, he knew what lay ahead. They were flying west toward the Atlantic Wall, the formidable line of German coastal defenses. The coast of Europe was lined with heavy anti-aircraft batteries and flak towers designed specifically to obliterate low-flying aircraft. If this B-17 tried to cross the coastline alone, the ground gunners would tear it apart. Stigler moved his hand, gesturing frantically to the American pilot. He pointed down toward the devastation of the German landscape. He was mouthing the words, "Land, land." He wanted them to set the plane down in a field. They would be captured, yes, but they would survive. The war would be over for them. Brown stared back, confused and terrified, shaking his head. He wouldn't surrender. Stigler changed tactics. He pointed emphatically to the north, toward the Baltic Sea. Sweden. Sweden was neutral. It was a short flight, just 30 minutes away. If the Americans turned north, they could crash land there. They would be interned for the rest of the war, treated well, and given medical care for their wounded. It was the logical choice. It was the sane choice. But Charlie Brown didn't understand. In the roar of the wind and the chaos of the cockpit, he thought the German pilot was telling him he was going to blow them out of the sky. Brown stubbornly kept the nose of the bomber pointed west, toward England, toward 250 miles of freezing ocean, toward the flak wall. Stigler cursed in his cockpit. The American was suicidal. He was flying a sieve into a meat grinder. Stigler checked his fuel gauge. He was running low. He checked his watch. He had been away from the base too long. Every second he stayed with this bomber increased the risk of another German fighter squadron spotting him. If they saw him flying alongside an enemy bomber without attacking, they wouldn't ask questions. They would shoot him down as a traitor. In the Third Reich, treason was not a gray area. It was a capital offense. A Luftwaffe pilot caught sparing the enemy faced a Kriegsgericht, a court-martial. The sentence was death by firing squad. Stigler knew this. He knew the regulations. He knew his duty. And yet, he looked at the terrified face of the young American pilot, and he looked at the blood frozen on the fuselage, and he realized he could not leave them to die. Franz Stigler made a decision that defied all military logic and self-preservation. He decided to become their shield. He tucked his Bf 109 in tight against the B-17's left wing. He flew formation with a precision that came from years of combat experience. The idea was simple but dangerous: camouflage. To the German gunners on the ground, the silhouette of two planes flying wingtip to wingtip would merge. If they looked up and saw a Bf 109, a friendly fighter, escorting a bomber, they would hold their fire. They would assume it was a captured American plane being ferried to a secret base for testing, or perhaps a Luftwaffe bomber involved in a special operation. It was a colossal bluff. They approached the coastline. The Atlantic Wall loomed ahead. Brown saw the concrete bunkers and the barrels of the flak guns tracking them. He flinched, waiting for the sky to erupt in black smoke. He watched the German fighter on his wing, wondering if this was the moment the trap would spring. On the ground, German gunners tracked the strange formation. Fingers hovered over firing buttons. Officers peered through binoculars. They saw the battered American bomber, limping and smoking. But right beside it, guarding it like a sheepdog, was a German Messerschmitt. The gunners hesitated. The order to fire never came. The distinct shape of the Bf 109 acted as a talisman, a cloak of invisibility against their own defenses. Stigler stayed with them until they crossed the beach. The white surf of the North Sea appeared below. They were out of German airspace. They were over open water. The flak guns remained silent. Stigler checked his fuel again. The needle was touching the reserve line. He had pushed his luck as far as it would go. If he stayed any longer, he wouldn't have enough gas to make it back to German soil. He would crash in the ocean and die. He had escorted the enemy through the gates of hell, but he could not carry them across the water. He pulled his fighter slightly ahead of the bomber and banked left, bringing his cockpit level with Charlie Brown's one last time. The two men looked at each other. There were no words. There was no radio frequency to bridge the gap between enemies. There was only the roar of the engines and the cold wind. Franz Stigler raised his gloved hand to his forehead. He snapped a sharp, crisp salute. It was a gesture of respect, a gesture of luck, a goodbye. Then he shoved the stick over. The Bf-109 peeled away in a sharp dive, its blue-gray camouflage blending instantly with the cold waves below. He turned 180 degrees, heading back toward a country that would execute him if it knew what he had just done. Charlie Brown watched him go. He slumped in his seat, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. He didn't know the German's name. He didn't know why he was still alive. All he knew was that the shark had become a dolphin, and the predator had become a guardian. But the miracle was only half over. Ye Olde Pub was still flying, but barely. They were over the North Sea, 250 miles from the safety of England. The bomber was a wreck. The No. 3 engine finally gave up the ghost, sputtering into silence. The propeller feathered. Now they were flying on one full-power engine and one damaged engine that was surging unpredictably. The aircraft was heavy, dragging through the air like a brick. The altimeter unwound. They dropped to 500 feet, then 200. The gray waves seemed to reach up for them. Brown ordered everything that wasn't bolted down to be jettisoned. Machine guns, ammunition boxes, armor plating, radio equipment. It all went out the hatch. They needed to shed weight to stay airborne. The flight across the North Sea was a 2-hour agony. Every creak of the airframe sounded like the end. The wounded men in the back were freezing. The radio operator, Sergeant Richard Petchout, whose eye had been damaged by shrapnel, tapped out a distress code on the remaining transmitter, blind and bleeding. SOS. SOS. He didn't know if anyone was listening. Brown wrestled the yoke, his muscles burning. He was flying purely on instinct and terror. He talked to the plane, coaxing it, begging it to hold together for just a few more miles. The coastline of East Anglia appeared as a dark smudge on the horizon. It was the most beautiful thing Charlie Brown had ever seen. They crossed the English coast at treetop height. They were too low to bail out. They were too damaged to make it to their home base at Kimbolton. Brown spotted a runway ahead. RAF Seething, a base used by the 448th Bomb Group. It wasn't home, but it was concrete. He dropped the landing gear. One wheel came down and locked. The other hung loose. The hydraulic systems were shot. The flaps were shredded. This wasn't going to be a landing. It was going to be a controlled crash. Brown lined up the runway, cut the power, and prayed. Ye Olde Pub hit the tarmac, screaming. The tires smoked. The bomber slewed sideways, the brakes failing. It skidded off the runway, plowing through the mud and grass, finally coming to a halt near the tree line. The silence that followed was deafening. The crew scrambled out. They carried their wounded. They pulled the body of Hugh Eckenrode from the tail. They stood on the wet English grass, shivering, looking back at the twisted metal carcass of their plane. They counted heads, 9 men breathing, 1 man dead. It was a miracle they were there at all. The debriefing took place the next morning. Charlie Brown, exhausted and shaken, stood before the intelligence officers of the 8th Air Force. He told them everything. He reported the flak. He reported the fighters. And then he reported the impossible. He told them about the lone Bf-109 that had intercepted them. He told them about the escort. He told them about the salute. The room went silent. The officers exchanged glances. This wasn't just unusual. It was dangerous. The Allied command was worried about the psychological state of their bomber crews. The air war was brutal. Dehumanizing the enemy was essential for morale. It was easier to drop bombs on cities if you believed the people below were monsters. It was easier to shoot down fighters if you believed the pilots were faceless Nazis. If word got out that a German pilot, a Hun, had shown chivalry and mercy, it would complicate the narrative. It might make the American crews hesitate. It might make them soft. Major Herbert Seiler, the intelligence officer, looked at Brown. "Lieutenant," he said, "someone decided you shouldn't be in that cockpit." He wasn't talking about God, he was talking about the German. Then came the order. It came from the very top. "You are to tell no one about this. This event never happened. It is classified top secret. If you speak of this to the press, or to your family, or to your fellow pilots, you will be court-martialed." Charlie Brown was stunned. He had just experienced a profound act of humanity, and now he was being ordered to bury it. He argued, but the brass was firm. The story of the German who didn't shoot was too dangerous for the war effort. Brown swallowed his anger and obeyed. He went back to his quarters. He told his crew to keep their mouths shut. And for 40 years, the secret of Ye Olde Pub remained buried in the classified archives of the U.S. Army Air Forces. 300 miles away, in a mess hall in Germany, Franz Stigler was doing the same thing. He landed his Bf 109 with the fuel vapor fumes running on empty. His mechanics looked at the bullet holes in his plane, damage from the earlier fights, and asked him if he had got the kill. Stigler nodded vaguely and walked away. He couldn't claim the victory. He couldn't verify the destruction of the B-17 because he hadn't destroyed it. To claim a kill he didn't make was a violation of honor, but to admit he let it go was a death sentence. Stigler sat alone, drinking ersatz coffee, his hands shaking. He thought about the faces of the men he had seen in the bomber. He wondered if they had made it. He wondered if the English Channel had swallowed them up, making his sacrifice meaningless. He would spend the rest of the war wondering. He flew hundreds more missions. He fought until the very end, eventually flying the revolutionary Me-2 jet fighter in the dying days of the Reich. He watched his country burn. He watched his friends die. And through it all, he kept the secret of December 20th locked in a box in the back of his mind. The war ended. The world moved on. The B-17s were scrapped and melted down into aluminum siding and soda cans. The Bf 109s were destroyed or put in museums. The men went home. Charlie Brown returned to West Virginia, went to college, got married, and lived a quiet life. Franz Stigler immigrated to Canada, becoming a businessman in Vancouver, trying to forget the ghosts of the Luftwaffe. But the thread that connected them never broke. It stretched across the Atlantic, invisible and silent, waiting for someone to pull on it. It would take nearly half a century, but the truth refuses to stay buried forever. A simple letter in a newsletter for pilots was about to spark one of the most emotional reunions in military history. The war ended, but the silence did not. For 40 years, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler lived parallel lives, separated by an ocean and a secret. Charlie Brown returned to the United States, went to college, and eventually rejoined the Air Force, serving in the new Cold War era. He retired as a lieutenant colonel, settled in Miami, and started a family. Franz Stigler, having lost his country and his career, left the ruins of Germany behind. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada with nothing but a suitcase and his skills as a mechanic. He rebuilt his life in Vancouver, British Columbia, becoming a successful businessman. They were two old soldiers fading into history. But the memory of December 20th, 1943 refused to fade. It haunted them both. Charlie Brown often lay awake at night, thinking about the mysterious German pilot. Who was he? Why had he spared them? Had he survived the war? Brown told the story only to a select few close friends at reunions, always in hushed tones, still wary of the classified order he had been given in 1943. But the need to know the truth grew stronger with age. He wanted to look the man in the eye and say thank you. Franz Stigler wondered too. He would watch TV documentaries about the air war and scan the footage of crashing B-17s, wondering if Ye Olde Pub had been one of them. Had his mercy been in vain? Had the bomber crashed in the North Sea, killing the crew he risked his life to save? He had no way of knowing. In 1986, the silence finally broke. Charlie Brown was speaking at a Gathering of Eagles event in Alabama. Someone asked him for a memorable combat story. Brown hesitated, then decided the statute of limitations on a 40-year-old secret had surely expired. He told the room about the German fighter pilot who didn't shoot. The audience was stunned. The story was impossible, magical. Encouraged by the reaction, Brown decided to launch a search. He started digging through the archives of the U.S. Air Force and the German Luftwaffe. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. But the records were incomplete, lost, or destroyed in the chaos of 1945. For 4 years, he hit dead ends. It seemed the German pilot was a ghost. In 1990, Brown tried one last desperation move. He wrote a letter to Jägerblatt, a newsletter for German fighter pilot veterans. In the letter, he detailed the encounter, the date, the location, the damage to his B-17, and the fact that a Bf-109 had escorted him to the coast. Franz Stigler, now 75 years old, was living in a quiet suburb of Vancouver. He received his copy of Jägerblatt and sat down to read it. When he saw the letter from Charles Brown, he nearly dropped his coffee cup. It was his story. It was the B-17. It was Ye Olde Pub. Stigler wrote a letter back. He kept it simple. "I was the one," he wrote. He included details only the pilot could know, the specific damage to the tail, the way he had tried to guide them to Sweden, the salute. When Charlie Brown received the letter, he was trembling. He picked up the phone and dialed the number in Canada. "Hello?" a voice answered, heavy with a German accent. "My name is Charlie Brown," he said. "I'm the pilot of the B-17 you escorted on December 20th, 1943. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, Franz Stigler began to weep. "I have wondered about you for 40 years, he said. The reunion was set for June 1990. They agreed to meet in the lobby of a hotel in Seattle, halfway between their homes. Charlie Brown arrived early. He was nervous. He was meeting the enemy. He was meeting his savior. When Franz Stigler walked into the lobby, the years melted away. He wasn't an old man. He was the pilot in the goggles. Brown wasn't a retiree. He was the terrified kid in the cockpit. The two men walked toward each other. They didn't shake hands. They embraced. They held on to each other and cried like children. "I love you, Charlie," Stigler whispered. They sat down and talked for hours. They went over every second of the flight. Stigler explained why he didn't shoot. He told Brown about Gustav Rodel and the Code of Honor. He told him about his brother August. "You were my brother that day," Stigler said. "I couldn't kill you any more than I could kill him." Brown showed Stigler photos of his children and grandchildren. "They are alive because of you," Brown said. "My family exists because you didn't pull the trigger." The two men became inseparable. They traveled together across North America and Europe, telling their story to schools, military bases, and museums. They called themselves brothers. They went fishing. They stayed at each other's houses. The bond between them was deeper than friendship. It was a connection forged in the fires of death and redemption. In 2008, the U.S. Air Force completed an investigation into the incident. Based on the testimony of both men and the newly declassified records, they decided to honor the crew of Ye Olde Pub. The surviving members were awarded the Silver Star. Charlie Brown received the Air Force Cross. It was a rare and belated recognition of their incredible survival. But the story had an ending that no scriptwriter could have written better. In March 2008, Franz Stigler passed away at the age of 92. Charlie Brown was devastated. He had lost the man who gave him his life twice, once over Germany, and once by becoming his best friend in his twilight years. 6 months later, in November 2008, Charlie Brown died. He was 87. It was as if he couldn't bear to be in a world without Franz. They left together, just as they had flown together that day in 1943. Before he died, Franz Stigler gave Charlie a book. Inside the cover, he wrote an inscription. In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December, 1943, I saved a B-17 from destruction. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz. The story of Ye Olde Pub is more than a war story. It is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest times, when the world demands hate, a single individual can choose humanity. Franz Stigler didn't just save a bomber crew that day, he saved his own soul. And in doing so, he proved that while soldiers fight wars, it is men who make peace. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps us share these incredible moments of history with the world. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a forgotten story from our archives. And let me know in the comments, do you think you could have made the choice Franz Stigler made? We read every single comment. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us keep the memory of Charlie and Franz alive.